The ban does not make your children safer. It makes them more unsafe. It makes all of us more unsafe. We are also giving them the tools to one day monitor us and to control us. Lawmakers trying to show to voters that the more they care, the more willing they are to use the strongest instruments, which is always forbidding things.
Maybe we should introduce an Orban test. If you want the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, to possess certain powers, and if the answer is no, then maybe those powers shouldn't be available to any government.
There is something called helicopter parenting that has become the norm in our generation.
There are better solutions, and I don't think the security of our children should come at the expense of an open and anonymous internet.
Hello and welcome to the heart of the European Parliament here in Brussels. My name is Adam Bartha and I'm the director of Epicenter, a network of 12 leading free market think tanks from across Europe. Today's topic is quite an emotional one because it's about children, in particular the online safety of children. Much of this discussion was sparked by Australia introducing a blanket ban on social media under the age of 16. EU leaders from Spain to France floated similar ideas here in Europe. And the discussion is happening at the same time as Europe is trying to reduce its digital red tape, as this was highlighted by the famous Draghi report as a key reason for the EU's lagging productivity growth compared to the US. To discuss all of this and more, I'm delighted to welcome Ana Vasconcelos, MEP, representing the Liberal Initiative of Portugal within Renew Europe. And I'm also very happy to welcome Dr. Diana Nasulea, who is a research expert at IES Europe based in Bucharest. Delighted to have you both. So we are simultaneously talking about a blanket ban under the age of 16 here in the EU, whilst we are talking about reducing red tape on digital and many other parts of the economy. So from a liberal perspective, as both of you come from a liberal tradition, how do you approach this blanket ban on social media under the age of 16?
Well, thank you, first of all, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you here discussing this important topic. I would like to start by saying that I'm actually in a minority position in my group, and I am very critical of the full blanket ban approach. Why? I think, first and foremost, it's an ineffective approach, and to add insult to injury, it is likely to put us all at risk because it entails basically that we have to upload, not just children, but all of us, to prove our age, documents like our driver's license, or biometric information. And all of this sensitive data will have to be stored somewhere and very likely subject to hacker attacks that right now we don't really have the conditions to prevent. So these are just a few reasons, but really, even if that risk did not exist, we need to ask ourselves if we really take seriously the risks, which no doubt exist to mental health, not just for children, but for adults as well, if just prohibiting without even first trying any other approach, which we really haven't, will really solve the issue? And will it actually lead to behaviors that are even more dangerous to monitor, basically pushing people out of monitorable spaces, online spaces, leaving us exposed, namely children, to an unmonitored online environment where they can be groomed, they can be cyberbullied, and because probably they break the ban, they will be less encouraged to report these abuses and therefore merit the protection that is needed to keep them safe.
So we will talk a lot about the unintended consequences, what digital IDs would mean for the general population. But you mentioned the important point that we haven't tried other ways yet. And I want to push back a little because the DSA, for example, already included certain parts that addressed how children should conduct online browsing, for example. So do you think that the issue is that some of our already existing toolkits are not being applied yet? Or do you think that this is not necessarily something that can be solved at an EU level, but it would be more on a national or even regional level?
It's true that the DSA has not yet been fully implemented and that it's been a challenge to enforce it. But still, there are other things that need to be addressed. For instance, phone-free spaces in schools. This is something that would probably contribute to increase their playtime, their social time, which will reinforce their ability to also resist to the consequences of online scrolling and online life. There are safety by design features that we have encouraged, especially device designers, to integrate. These would basically help parents who are not as digitally literate as often their children are to, by default, safeguard their children's behavior on their devices. Most parents are not even acquainted with this. Only the most informed parents are. So even informing parents and helping them prepare their children for the inevitable part of life that is now the digital world that they're going to grow into, so they can build resilience gradually, like they have to with other parts of life, those really haven't been attempted. And we have to really think of the mental health issues that we're facing these days as a holistic issue. And they're not, social media is something that is addictive and that aggravates these risks. But there is more. The whole way that children are growing up, even just exposed to the events of the world right now. I mean, if we're really considering going this way with a blanket ban for social media, should we consider it also for TV, for news programs that right now, even for adults, are a bit too heavy with constant reporting on catastrophes and very concerning things that are happening around the world. All of these contribute to a mental health crisis that we see emerging in our society. So again, the blanket ban on its own is not the most effective way to address this, and it's not like we've really tried other ways of tackling this.
So Anna mentioned that education should play an important role, right? You're an educator, you're also a mom. How do you see the kind of most charitable interpretation of the people who support the blanket ban? So if you look around you in the educational sector or other parents, what do you think is the main driver behind this kind of approach that, okay, under the age of 16, you cannot smoke, you cannot drink, so you shouldn't be able to use social media that may harm your mental health as well?
Well, first of all, I think I understand where this is coming from. You know, I understand regulators, I understand parents, I understand educators that want to do something. When you see a problem, you want to find a solution. But from a principles point of view, a ban should be the last resort, right? Should be the last solution you look to when you've tried everything else and you realize that everything else has failed. But we are not there yet. We have not tried all the measures that are at our disposal to mitigate some of the risks. When it comes to educating our children, knives are dangerous as well. Going outside is dangerous as well. But we trust parents to be able to teach their kids how to use knives and how to go outside safely, right? So maybe we should do the same when it comes to social media. Maybe we should invest more in media literacy. And when it comes to this, we are very different, as European nations. In Romania, for example, the country I'm coming from, the digital skills of kids are not so developed as in other European countries. So maybe Romania should be insisting more on this, should be insisting on, giving the children the tools needed to navigate through social media. Maybe we should insist more on offering parents the tools that they might use to control what their kids are doing on social media. Maybe we should trust schools to try different approaches. I would actually like to see that, schools and communities competing to find better and better solutions that can be used to mitigate these risks, to show children that they can have fun outside social media and so on. So I think this is the better approach. We have to take a step back. We have to say, okay, we don't have the best solution yet. There is no one-size-fits-all solution that can be applied right now. So let's try different approaches and see what works.
So both of you essentially acknowledge that the problem is real. Mental health is important, and especially for children and teenagers, it's a topic that's highly relevant. But I want to come back to the point that you have mentioned previously about some of the possible unintended consequences of a blanket ban. So if this is introduced, then everyone needs to verify their age online, irrespective whether they're a child or an adult. So how would that look in practice, and what are your worries or thoughts related to kind of an age verification that's rolled across the whole EU?
The biggest unintended consequence is really the risk that this represents for all of us in terms of protecting our privacy, or exposing our privacy, I should say. The fact that we would have to upload some form of identification document on third-party platforms, or use our biometric data, and this is very sensitive data that will be stored, and it's not like we can right now guarantee protection against hacking, especially when we are in a sort of Cold War global scenario where warfare is increasingly done with this type of hybrid risk and hybrid attack. It is increasing the level of risk for a very low guarantee of effectively addressing the problem that we're really trying to solve. Quite the opposite. But there are other unintended consequences. We often hear a comparison between social media and cigarettes, for example, but it's not exactly the same thing. First of all, cigarettes is something that's desirably one could avoid and go through life without ever having to experiment. Social media, much likely so. We are very likely to engage eventually with this type of digital platform. But more than that, even for children and teenagers, if we could actually just delay the age of exposure to this part of reality and then have them learn all at once how to deal with it, just like adults who did not grow up in this era had to, and perhaps are even more exposed than younger people are these days because they grew up with these technologies. Even if that were the case, social media has actually brought benefits for many children, especially in minority circumstances. So, for instance, LGBT children, they have found support, especially when they are in families that are not, receptive or prepared to deal with sexuality issues. The support that they could find with peers online, this helps them in that developing stage and realizing that it's normal. And there are other examples of this unintended consequence, that children will now be prevented from that resource when, at the same time, they're increasingly isolated at home. There is something called helicopter parenting that has become the norm in our generation. It used to be normal for a child to be unsupervised at the age of 10, wandering the streets. That is de facto not desirable these days because that is risky. But nowadays, children are often too supervised in their real life environment. And that's actually why they often seek the online environment for an escape. Being barred of that without also dealing with the consequences of the overly supervised childcare that we now provide in our societies is also leaving a large part of the problem unaddressed.
It's interesting that you mentioned kind of the positive aspects of social media, because I feel like in this whole debate, this is totally gone. So everyone focuses on the potential downsides and the problems, but we actually never talk about the potential benefits. And then I think the LGBTQ question for teenagers is especially an important and relevant one. But Diana, I want to talk a little bit more about the unintended consequences and how the internet would look like if mandatory age verification were introduced in the EU. So we talked a lot about the Great Chinese Wall, not just the physical one, but also the internet one. So if the EU decides to go ahead with this proposal, or even if some member states of the EU decide to go ahead, how would that change the internet? What would be the practical consequence of EU citizens having to verify their age online?
Well, it depends on how you do this. At this moment, we have a few methods that we can use to, check the age of someone who wants to create a social media profile. So the first one is, biometric scans. This is what they're doing in Australia. However, we see that it's very easy to circumvent those. There are reports of kids as young as 10 years old managing to just put some makeup on and bypass that. So that's very easy. You're just creating something that makes kids very creative because they might want to try and see if they can trick the system. Then there is this issue that you talked about regarding uploading some sort of document. And here is where this all becomes very, very complicated, because where do you draw the line? Do you just do that for like the big platforms that are out there? But then other platforms might pop up. Kids might use VPNs to log into different platforms that come from the United States or from Asia, and that are not regulated in the same way. So you're basically also losing the user base of the European market to other markets that are more open to children. You might be also pushing children into dark corners of the internet where they don't have the means to report cyberbullying and other problems. So this is one of the problems. Then, what do you do with the data? I mean, we don't trust companies to be able to, build safe spaces for our children, but then we trust them with the data of our children and with our data. And one of the things that you mentioned that I think most people don't really understand is that it's not only children that will have to upload some sort of verification, it's all of us. Do you just, ask social media platforms to do this, or like every website that has a chat has to do that? Every game that has a comment section or a chat where kids can talk to each other? Should you ask people to just upload their data to all sorts of websites? Because this creates a nightmare, a nightmare from all sorts of perspectives, especially from a privacy perspective, and it might lead to, identity theft and other bigger issues that will then have to be mitigated.
If I may come back on unintended consequences, first of all, if we look at what's going on in the US, and not just the US, we can look at other countries in Europe. I think the big lesson of this century so far is that our very consolidated democracies are not, it's not impossible for them to unravel. And we're seeing the boundaries of the oldest democracy on earth being tested right now very strongly. And we're seeing also how important it is for citizens to have mechanisms of resisting abuse of power, of violent use of police power, and so on. Now, if we bear this in consideration, and we acknowledge that right now we are, if we keep going down this route, empowering our institutions to monitor us more and more, just like autocratic states are doing, and we are seeing that the risks of our democracies being unable, or actually having in power those who are not moved by the most noble concerns of safeguarding our freedoms, safeguarding our security, making sure that our democratic voice has space in our society, then we are also giving them the tools to one day monitor us in case these forces come to power, to monitor us and to control us, and to prevent us from restoring democracy in the event that that is necessary. So we cannot legislate assuming that all circumstances will remain the same. We have to always assume what will an abuse of power do with the laws and the precedents that we are creating. Furthermore, right now, as Diana just pointed out, the use of VPNs will probably be, will increase to circumvent this ban. So this might motivate, in this prohibitive mindset that we are seeing, the lawmakers to then prohibit VPNs. And this will have other unintended consequences because these tools end up, first of all, they're essential for citizens to resist power in current autocratic states. But beyond that, whistleblowing in our communities, protecting anonymity is important. Also, what about victims of other types of abuse, even adults? Imagine a woman who's a victim of physical abuse, of rape, from her partner, for instance. The fact that she will have to, in order to access several types of support online, including social media communities of support, where she can perhaps start to get informed of how she can evade the situation of risk that she is in, the situation of danger that she is in, she will have to submit her identity. Imagine that her documents are confiscated. Furthermore, imagine other minorities who are undocumented and need to pursue the help of authorities. So these are several unintended consequences that really make our fundamental rights very hard to exercise in our societies.
I think your point about government overreach and power is very important, and maybe we should introduce an Orban test, if you like. Do you want the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, to possess certain powers? And if the answer is no, then maybe those powers shouldn't be available to any government. So I think that's an excellent point. But I do want to talk a little bit about the roles of different governments and the EU. Because if it's not happening on an EU level, it may happen on a national level. We have already heard the French government, the Spanish government, even the Portuguese government planning to introduce a blanket ban under the age of 16. So do you think it's likely that it's going to happen on a national level, at least in some member states, and then we can draw the consequences based on their experience? Or do you think that they will try to find a common ground on an EU level, and as imperfect as the compromise may be, we're going to come up with a common European solution?
Yes, I should say that in Portugal, this is currently being discussed in Parliament. And actually, it's a very severe interference that also entails other measures of more control of our online life that go beyond age verification. I think that first and foremost, we should be concerned at enforcing this at EU level. So I would rather have it enforced in some member states, and then we see how it goes, than immediately start at the top level. That being said, of course, I would rather this not be the approach for all the reasons that we've been seeing here. It is, at the end of the day, we should focus on empowering parents and families to approach this and basically introduce their children and also learn to deal with them, these dangers themselves, with the most margin for trial and error to see what works before we go here. If there are some member states that want to start at this level and show how, we have this tendency, I would actually like to make an important point, which is something I'm very concerned about as a liberal. Which is lawmakers trying to show to voters, especially on popular issues, that the more they care, the more willing they are to use the strongest, bluntest instruments we have in our toolkit, which is always forbidding things, right? And really forbidding things is disempowering citizens at the end of the day. So it's always in the name of our safety, of nobler values, but it does gradually erode our freedoms and our agency, our free agency, and our ability to learn to live in the world as it is by being sheltered from it. So these bans, I think, are problematic at any level that they are enforced, but to the extent that they are going to be attempted, then let's make sure that they are first tried at the more local or national levels of government or regional levels of governance before being addressed at this level, at the European level, because then we leave out room. I would actually give a very quick example. We saw during COVID different approaches in different member states. And we saw down the line, and actually different approaches that at the time were very criticized in some member states, either for being too excessive or too excessively restrictive or unrestrictive, right? And down the line, including in our mental health, by the way, and in the development of children, we are now seeing the consequences of the most restrictive approaches that weren't clear at the time, because at the time the metric was just the number of victims of the COVID pandemic and not really the impact of the restrictive measures on especially child development. We're now seeing the effects of that. We are seeing one of the generations, paradoxically enough, in the most informed age of our history, being less capable, less literate, less able to concentrate. And it's in part also because of the overly restrictive measures that we saw during COVID. So it is important to ensure that we have pluralism in Europe, very strong European value, and that we allow member states to try different approaches so each one can learn from each and basically, based on comparative politics, learn what the best approaches are.
So harmonization is not always the most beneficial to the single market, but we talk about the single market fragmentation quite a lot. So what would be your approach, Diana?
So, firstly, bans are a blunt instrument that create a security theater. Now, that being said, the EU is now in a great position. We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity because for the first time, the EU was not the first body to come up with such a regulation. So we can actually, draw some conclusions from what's been happening in other states that have imposed such bans. So we can look at Australia. Of course, it's too early to have all the data necessary to assess the real impact of the blanket ban in Australia. But for now, we can already see that it does not reduce the risk. It does not reduce the mental health associated issues with social media because kids find ways to circumvent those biometric scans or whatever they're using to check for the age. At the level of the European Union, I agree with what Anna has said. Subsidiarity is a great thing. We should be letting communities, preferably smaller communities, not even at the national level, to come up with different ways to approach this. It is much better than having, a blanket ban at the level of the European Union, because again, we are talking about different countries, different communities. In Romania, I suspect that this will not be very popular. We have huge communities of people who are not documented, who lack the physical documents to go through these verifications. We have communities where there's one phone per household, per family. So having to use that one phone to verify the identity of several people might be very, very complicated from a tech point of view. People lack these digital skills. So yeah, I agree. I think at this point, we should not be so worried about fragmenting the single market, and we should be letting communities, countries find different approaches. Of course, I'm not for the ban, but I think it's better to impose this at local or national level than at the level of the European Union.
Sure.
Yeah, very quickly, I think it's important to add that we often hear that the ban is science-based. It's not. The problem is science-based. Actually, the ban is highly contested among the scientific community and also by organizations whose sole purpose is to protect our privacy. Several concerns in civil society have been raised. Also, I mean, we hear that the parents call for help in addressing this issue, and we should take it very seriously. And there are many things that we can do to help parents address this. But there are also parents who are not satisfied that this is the approach taken, who do feel disempowered in the way they're educating their children. And the state should not be replacing them. They should be helping them in their role as caregivers and the ones who are introducing their children to adulthood, but not replacing them.
So now we're in a European Parliament. It's always a kind of policy discussion. But if you're talking directly to parents who are supportive of the blanket ban under the age of 16, if you have to convince them in kind of 30 seconds why you're against the ban, what would your pitch be to them?
The ban is a solution that is not really addressing the issue. It gives us a false sense of security that actually makes us more unsafe, more exposed. Children will be more exposed, parents will be more exposed, all of us will be more exposed. And it will not even come close to addressing the real issue, which is how do we empower you, the parent, and your children to face the real challenges that all of us are facing online and to curb mental health risks.
Same question to you, Diana. So if you're talking to a fellow parent in the school where you're teaching and you have to explain to them, well, you may be supportive of this idea, but there are some possible downsides, how would you try to convince them?
I would say that I share the worries. I'm also a parent. I have the same worries. I think there are risks to being online, but I oppose blanket bans not because I don't care, but because I don't think they address the root cause of this problem. I think there are other ways that we can try. I think that through choice and through education, we can actually build a safer online space, both for us and for our children. And I don't think the security of our children should come at the expense of an open and anonymous internet. There are better solutions, and ultimately, children's mental health and their well-being is the responsibility of the parent, not the responsibility of the state.
Well, it's clear that both of you are united in understanding the possible downsides of social media as well as the upsides, but also very much the unintended consequences of a possible blanket ban. So thank you very much for openly talking about this issue. It's a very emotional one. So I really, really appreciated your frankness. And you have heard a lot of different ideas on the Liberal position on blanket social media bans for teenagers and children. But of course, you're very welcome to share your own suggestions in the comments, especially if you would be impacted by the ban, either as a teenager yourself or as a parent. But for now, a massive thank you to both of you for your insights. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I hope you have enjoyed it too. And if so, don't forget to click subscribe and follow Epicenter on our social media channels. But for now, thank you very much and see you next month for a new conversation live from the European Parliament.